Hi, everybody. Welcome to the fifth of our seminars on decolonizing educational relationships. Now that we're halfway through, at the halfway point, we're going to give you an overview of how the seminars so far fit into our overall imaginary. And we stress that this is our imaginary and that there will be many other ways of decolonizing relationships. Fran?
Okay, so just to say a little bit about our progress through the seminars as a whole, because obviously this is a series. In the first three seminars, we introduced the ideas of coloniality and decoloniality, followed by a close look at whiteness, race and racism in education. And those are sort of represented in the red circle at the bottom there. And from that, we identified the need for teachers and educators to have a critical awareness of the historical, socio-cultural, and geopolitical influences on their identities, positionalities, and subjectivities, and how these play out in educational contexts. And we argued that this required us, or requires us, I should say, to decenter whiteness and coloniality through unlearning some of our habitual ways of relating through our teacher ontologies. And then last month, in the fourth seminar, we then proposed spirituality as a foundational idea in our imaginary for decolonizing educational relationships. And what we're doing now is building on this by exploring two further conceptual frameworks that we've used to bring a more spiritual relational dimension to educational relations. So today's seminar, number 5, is looking at the ideas of invitation and hospitality. And then next month in seminar 6, we're going to be focusing on spaces, places, and boundaries.
So in each of our seminars, we have shown how our personal narratives have helped us to build theory. To make the rationale for this more explicit, we draw on Kakali Bhattacharya's 2019 chapter, Theorizing from the Streets. In this chapter, Bhattacharya explores the process of unlearning colonial and privileged discourses using the key idea of theorizing from the streets. The processes she engaged in become a conscious effort to integrate information from outside the academic gaze, viewing everyday experiences as legitimate sources and forms of knowledge. Theorizing from the streets thus constituted an onto-epistemic, methodological, contemplative, and aesthetic move or turn from that which was privileged, traditional, and or deconstructive. This form of theorizing, using what some also call folk knowledge, is an invitation to imagine, play, and expand, rather than accepting the limitations of the binary relations of resistance and freedom, the oppressor and the oppressed. Accordingly, we begin the seminar with two narratives that demonstrate our processes in theorizing, invitation, and hospitality from the streets.
I'm going to begin here with an experience that Fatima and I shared in 2016 when Fatima was in England as a visiting academic at the University of Exeter. And my elder sister, Anne, had her, and by the way, I've changed all of the names here. My elder sister had her 60th birthday during Fatima's stay. And so we were both invited to my sister's party. And at the time of the party, Anne's eldest daughter, Rachel, had been living with me for 3 years and had been dating her boyfriend, Simon, for about 2 of those years. While driving to the party, Fatima asked me whether Simon would be there at the party because she hadn't met him yet. And I explained how Rachel had invited him, but that for the last couple of months, he hadn't given a firm answer one way or the other. Both Rachel and her boyfriend were at that time in their late 30s and wary of long-term commitments. But my reading of the situation was that Rachel was ready to take the relationship one step further by including Simon in this family event. And Fatima asked me why Simon wouldn't commit to accepting the invitation to an event that was so obviously important to Rachel. And she started to reflect on what might be happening in this situation. And Fatima, you didn't you? You imagined the space of the party as being Rachel's family space, and as Simon being an outsider to this space. Simon might perceive Rachel's invitation as inviting him into a space in which he would be a stranger. And in offering the invitation, Rachel had indicated a level of commitment to the relationship that might not have been there before. However, rather than giving Rachel a straightforward answer of yes or no, Simon exercised power over her by neither accepting nor rejecting the invitation outright. So as we discussed this, it provided a way for us to think about what it means to invite somebody into a space that they don't feel ownership of. And for example, from a student's perspective, we could imagine that a classroom would be seen as the teacher's space rather than the student's. So how might a teacher establish positive social relationships in what's perceived to be her space? How might she invite students into that space? And while there's nothing new in the idea of teachers establishing positive relationships with her students, what counts as positive relationships, as we've argued before, may be based on Euro-Western colonial ideas of, for example, what it means to be inviting, what it means to be caring, using student-centered teaching methods, and so on. So this scenario provided us with an experience that we discussed, drawing on the differences in our respective cultural ways of viewing, being, and doing as well, and how these might help us develop decolonial ways of being inviting, which would involve a holistic understanding of what it means that includes a spiritual dimension, as we talked about in our last seminar.
So here I'm going to relate the narrative or the experience that Fran and I went through, which we have used the term hospitality to encompass. So in the following narrative, I'm going to relate one example which Fran and I experienced together, and how we started to think about how we could use this to theorize and put to practice in education, in particular in relation to educational relationships in classroom spaces. Fran and I had been working together for several months when I invited her to the University of Regina to work with me on this project. It was wintertime. There was snow and ice on the ground and roads, and the temperature in Regina fluctuated from -15 to -35 degrees centigrade. Fran was staying with me for the whole semester, that is from January to April. Now, Fran has different dietary requirements to mine. And before she came to Regina, she sent me a list of foods that she could not eat. So in her email, this is what she stated. I'm vegetarian. I'm allergic to mushrooms. I'm highly intolerant to yeast, so no bread, and anything with a culture, so no yogurt, or that has gone through a fermentation process to make it cheese, tofu, soya sauce. I'm highly intolerant to refined sugar and have difficulty with citrus fruits. I'm fine with eggs and milk and cream. I'm fine with all pulses, grains, etc., as long as they have not been put with yeast to make something. So I read this and I thought, okay, no problem, Fatima, you can deal with this. And so really there should be no problems. And so before we carry on, I want to give you some context about my spiritual roots. So my ancestors were Hindus who originated from Western India, from Gujarat and Kutch, and we were part of the Lohana caste in the caste system that they have there. In the 15th century, we converted to the Shia Ismaili Nizari sect of Islam. In order to facilitate the conversion, several of the Hindu customs, rituals, and traditions were kept and practiced alongside Islamic ways. One of those customs that we continue to practice even today emanated from Indian Buddhist philosophy. And in Sanskrit, the phrase is Atitha Devo Bhava. This is the practice where we revere a guest or guests with the same respect as we would to God. Islam also embodies a similar philosophy. Islam holds hospitality as a virtue that lies at the very basis of the Islamic ethical system, a concept rooted in the pre-Islamic Bedouin virtues of welcome and generosity in the harsh desert environment. The concept can be found in the Arabic root dayafa, and the Prophet is reported to have said, "There is no good in the one who is not hospitable." So, I come truly to this way of being hospitable. So each day when Fran was here, we went to the university together, where I shared my office with her. And at the end of the day, we would go back to my place and I would cook supper for the two of us. I was fine with the list, but in general, when Fran was staying with me, I cooked 2 meals for each meal, one that would suit Fran and one that would work for me. 3 or 4 times a week, I would eat exactly what Fran ate. Fran did offer to cook for herself, but as part of my spiritual inheritance, my cultural frames of reference, and customs and rituals, I felt it was my duty to cook her meals, help her with her laundry, buy all the food that we needed, and pay for all the meals when we went to the restaurants, tickets to the movies, and so on. I thought of Fran as a very honored guest or friend. So as I mentioned before, we come legitimately to our case in point. I was simply trying to act in the manner that I'd been brought up in. A month went by and all was well. In the second month, I was getting tired of the responsibility. I was getting tired of having to give up the TV shows that I liked to watch so that Fran could choose what she wanted to watch. I was getting tired of cooking, thinking of vegetarian dishes to cook. I was tired of allergies, thinking about allergies, cleaning, and trying to teach, work on our research, and entertaining Fran. As I mentioned at the beginning of the narrative, it was bitterly cold outside, and we really couldn't go anywhere except to the shops, university, maybe see a film on the weekend, or go out to an Indian restaurant, because that was the only place that guaranteed Fran could get something to eat that would not give her an allergic reaction. So the tension started to rise. Fran was feeling cooped up in the apartment, not being able to go for long walks as she was accustomed to in England. And as I had not involved her in much of the daily living tasks, she felt helpless. And she was also used to having her privacy, which was difficult to do in my apartment. She did offer to pay for groceries, films, and so on, but I wouldn't hear of it because it would have gone against the very fiber of my being. So in our readings around our experience, we came across Derrida and his theories of conditional and unconditional hospitality and the concept of aporia. Hospitality is a philosophical concept that was developed by Jacques Derrida in the context of individual relations in France and the reception of immigrants and refugees by the state, the core ideas of which have most commonly been applied to educational relationships in culturally plural settings. Aporia is the paradox, the tensions and the ways in which power is enacted and how it changes. So that although I was the host and Fran the guest, I with the power to give and Fran the receiver, the balance of power had shifted over time so that Fran was also was also wielding power. I became the oppressed and Fran the oppressor. Although there are the examples that we can provide, this experience was the catalyst that started us thinking about how hospitality is enacted in educational relationships, and in particular, the power relations between the teacher and students, and how student agency is enacted in classrooms, and how we could use the concepts of invitation and hospitality to act as mediators towards changing existing educational relationships.
Thanks, Fatima. Okay, so we're going to be connecting those sort of approaches to street theorizing on invitation and hospitality. And here we're going to start by doing that in relation to, again, the discourses of coloniality. And to do that, we're returning to the framework from the film The Uprising that we've used in previous seminars. And here we're identifying some of the lies of coloniality as we perceive them in education policies and practices. And in doing so, we really want to stress that we're not saying that when using this terminology or the narratives and theoretical frames at an individual level, people are necessarily deliberately lying. Our purpose is to demonstrate how at a systematic level or a structural level, things are often presented as either neutral or as a good that it's hard to argue with. And yet, when we use a critical decolonial lens, it's possible to reveal alternative truths that are hidden underneath these discourses. So there are a number of examples in the slide, and we're not going to go through them all. What we're going to do is just to focus on the example of diversity and inclusion as terms that have come into great currency over the last few years in education. And they're terms that are widely used and portrayed as positive, as an assumed good. However, a government document in the UK that we looked at that's published in 2018 states, and I'm quoting from it here, inclusive education means that students with disabilities and other disadvantages are taught with their peers in a mainstream classroom for a majority of the school day. So immediately the use of the term disadvantage for us reveals a deficit understanding of inclusion, in which certain differences are judged against a mainstream ableist standard. And then when the same document states later on that other attributes should also be taken into account, such as ethnicity, language, gender, and socioeconomic status, it becomes clear that the advantaged norm that creates the standard is that of an able, white, English-speaking, well-off male. So when associated with, for example, the widening participation policy in higher education, some facts that have been selected as evidence of success of this policy could be, for example, the rise in numbers of students from Black and Brown communities who have been admitted to universities. The narrow defining of diversity as representation, we would argue, fails to address the whiteness of the university system and arguably contributes to the persistence of attainment gaps that exist, with particularly wide gaps being observed between white and Black students in relation to degree attainment, something that's now being addressed by the Universities UK initiative. And in terms of the concepts that we're exploring in this seminar, this could be understood as universities inviting a wider range of students into the educational spaces, but not thinking through whether those spaces are hospitable to the differences Black and Brown students bring with them. So then if we use those ideas and go back to the funnel diagram that we introduced in our first seminar, it shows how coloniality creates oppressive relations at the level of government that then trickle down through how the nation is imagined as a community of citizens, and again down to education and the curriculum, how they are conceived, and the sorts of teacher-student relations that might be possible. And on the right-hand side, we give some examples of the effects of these oppressive relations and the ways in which they are alienating and dehumanizing. For example, as we've already argued, there is a lack of a spiritual dimension to relations. There has been a rise in mental health issues. There's a lack of trust, as shown through QAA, the Research Excellence Framework, the Teaching Excellence Framework, and with regard to education itself, Ofsted. There's the hegemony of curriculum assessment and instruction that doesn't serve all students equally. And there's also arguably a de-intellectualization of teacher and teacher education profession. And again, we just want to stress that the list is common to all universities at a system level, but that within these, there are differences in how specific universities seek to mitigate some of the harmful effects. For example, at Exeter, there's the REAM network, there's the Equity and Diversity and Inclusion, there's Social Mobility Centre, the Exeter Decolonising Network, and so on. And all of these are working hard to try and do some of that mitigation. However, we also recognise that the graduate school, postgraduate certificate in education programs that are training future teachers for school education, there is very little space provided because of the additional level of control by external agencies such as the Department for Education and the Teaching Agency.
So power is usually understood as being used oppressively. At the same time, from government policy through to teacher actions in the classroom, portraying education and educational relations as neutral is a successful mechanism for evading considerations of power and thus maintaining the status quo. Yet power is present in the forms shown here and influence whose knowledges and ways of being and doing and viewing the world are seen to be legitimate, whose ways are included and whose excluded. However, although power exists in all relations, it is not always used oppressively. We argue that explicit recognition of these forms of power are essential if the ideas of invitation, hospitality, and spirituality are to have the power to disrupt oppressive discourses and to develop new, more equitable relations between teachers and students. This means recognizing the power that students also hold, for example, the power to refuse the invitation, as we demonstrated in the example of Fran's sister's 60th birthday party. In Martin Buber's seminal work, I and Thou, he theorizes about different forms of human relations. His basic position was that we need to resist the temptation to reduce human relations to the simple either-or ways of relating to others. He proposed that humans are beings that can enter into dialogic relations, not just with human others, but with other animate beings such as animals or a tree, as well as with the spiritual, existential, or divine thou. Buber developed a three-part theory in which each part interrelates with the other, not a sequential thing. The next 3 slides gives an overview of each part.
And what we're doing here is we're integrating Martin Buber's theory with our own street theorizing around invitation and hospitality. So Buber's central thesis is a twofold attitude where he says that I is always spoken in relation to either it or thou. And the I-it relation is one of between subjects and objects. And they have the following characteristics. It's a relationship of subject to object, a sort of form of indirect knowing that comes from viewing the world as something that's met or related to through experience, control, and rationality. It's therefore a monological, unidirectional relationship. It has a seeking to know and use in order to control orientation, and relations therefore have an agenda. It's a relation of separation, a distancing between self and other that emphasizes individuality, and it requires only part of oneself in the relationship through its analytical approaches. I-it relations can therefore only be partial or fragmented. The I-thou relation, on the other hand, is a relation that occurs in encounters between subjects and that exceeds the range of the Cartesian subject-object relation. The I-thou relation is felt as a mutual present relationship and has the following characteristics. It's a subject-subject relation, a form of direct relating that comes from viewing the world as being met through an encounter with humility. It's dialogic in the sense and present in the sense of being in the moment, mutual and open. It's a relation that can't be sought, but is rather a relation of togetherness, a being with that doesn't use, but emphasizes connectivity. It involves the whole being, an authentic being fully with another. And finally, Buber said it's therefore an ethical relation that some refer to as love. And Buber spoke of the paradox that every thou in our world, and I'm quoting from him now, must become an it. It does not matter how exclusively present the thou was in the direct relation, as soon as it has been worked out in the sense of being thought of as fully known rather than constantly emerging, or has been permeated with a means, the thou becomes an object among other objects. Perhaps the chief, but still one of them, fixed in its size and limits. For example, in the work of art, realization in one sense means loss of reality in another.
So Buber argues that life at a societal level has become dominated by the I-it subject to object relations. And we can see this in the way education has become treated as if it is part of the market economy. Teachers in schools are judged by the results. The curriculum serves a predetermined purpose of creating a workforce and a citizenry that conforms to the imaginary of British identity that we have discussed in our first presentation. The league tables are seen as a way of identifying which schools offer best value for money to help parents make informed choices about where to send their children. In order for this sort of system to work, everything is treated as if it is an object that can be measured against standardized objective criteria administered through national and international tests. However, as we have demonstrated in previous seminars, these so-called objective criteria are based on mainstream white colonial ways of viewing, doing, and being in the world. It is not hard to see that I-it relations are relations of separation in which both teachers and students might find it hard to connect to the curriculum and each other. But for those students whose identities are different from the mainstream, and as we have said, the majority of teachers come from the mainstream dominant culture, the sense of disconnectedness and alienation is often far greater. Buber argues that there needs to be more of a balance between I-thou and I-it relations. He's not saying that I-thou should replace I-it relations, but that society and therefore education needs to create the space for both. Without the inclusion of I-thou, ethical, spiritual relations that happens at the classroom level becomes an othering and impoverished form of education.
So then if we move to life at a spiritual level, which holds an attitude of being with, for Buber, in considering this, the concept of encounter is really important. And he looked at or viewed encounter as an event or a situation in which relation occurs. And he said that we can only grow and develop once we have learned to live in relation with each other and to recognize the possibilities of the space between us. And the fundamental means of this relation in the space is dialogue. And Buber talked of what he called genuine dialogue. And this genuine dialogue could be spoken or silent, but one where each of the participants really has in mind the other or others in their present and particular being, and turns to them with the intention of establishing a living mutual relation between him or herself and them. So this relation of togetherness, of being with, is one that doesn't set out to use or to set conditions on the relationship, but as we said, emphasizes connectivity. And to enter into such a relationship, requires being in a state of readiness. It means that the self has to put aside one's own desires to approach with humility and, through that dialogic interaction, to get to know each other fully as whole beings. Buber describes this as an authentic, spiritual, and ethical relationship. And if we translate this form of relationship into a classroom setting, this would mean that the teacher wouldn't approach that relationship with the students based on assumptions or stereotypes about who they might be, but would be inviting and hospitable to the students' authentic selves based on that holistic understanding of who they are that comes through the reciprocal relationship. And a holistic understanding isn't bounded by particular sets of purposes and objectives. It's an unconditional togetherness using the whole being and reliant on the development of mutual trust. So Buber envisages this as a process of creating a dialogical community, a third way between individualism and collectivism. And community he viewed as the realm of between individuals who would move between the I-it and the I-our relations and back again in a constant movement. And the quality of life in that community, and here we're talking about community or thinking about it in educational terms, will depend on the extent to which either relations exist within it.
We're going to move beyond abyssal thinking, which is what in the situation that we're in at the moment. So modern Western thinking is an abyssal thinking. It consists of a system of visible and invisible distinctions, the invisible ones being the foundation of the visible ones. The invisible distinctions are established through radical lines that divide social reality into two realms, the realm of this side of the line and the realm of the other side of the line. The division is such that the other side of the line vanishes as reality becomes non-existent and is indeed produced as non-existent. That is, not existing in any relevant or comprehensible way of being. What most fundamentally characterizes abyssal thinking is thus the impossibility of the co-presence of the two sides of the line. Moving beyond abyssal thinking involves the following conditions. And I'm not going to read them out. You can see them on the slide. Of these, Sousa Santos identifies intercultural translation as the most characteristic post-abyssal feature. Buber argued that the most blatant manifestation of the I-it ego orientation in modern societies is the nation state, which he did not view as a true community because it is one built on a fragmented distancing of self and other. An I-thou orientation would be a world that is a single body, understood as interconnected, interdependent, and interrelational. To create such a community requires a living center, someone who is a fully realized person, who lives the twofold attitude to relations, a human on earth whose spirit flows through. The living center acts as a guide or teacher, creating and supporting forms of communal life, whose members share the goal of developing individually and communally. Such a community would mediate between the metaphysic and the material social character of reality, and thus careful attention would be needed on the in-between spaces of I-it, I-thou, spiritual, social, and material relations. Reading Buber, it seems that such processes do not appear spontaneously. Rather, it comes about through, first, their taking their stand in mutual relation with the living center, and second, their being in living mutual relation with one another. The second has its source in the first, but is not given when the first alone is given. The image here that was also on our title slide is a way I found of expressing the complex interconnected relationality between teachers and students in educational spaces. It came out of a discussion Fran and I were having over a year ago and before we came across Buber's idea of a living center and community. It's another example of our theorizing from our own experiences through our own conversations and then going to the literature to see if others have thought about similar things. Rather than this being a process of validation, we see it as a process of expanding theory by putting ours and Buber's ideas in conversation with each other.
Okay, so this is now our representation of classrooms as critical intercultural spaces, or how we might move from the coloniality of classrooms as represented on the left-hand side towards the decolonial way of thinking about classroom spaces. And what we're saying is that rather than classrooms being dominated by mainstream culture and being potentially uninviting and inhospitable to all other ways of being and doing and viewing, classrooms can be reimagined as spaces of critical intercultural interaction, interrelation, interconnection, and interdependence. So these are interactions between intersecting dimensions of all aspects of identity, to include ethnicity, gender, religion, class, disability, sexuality, language, age, and so on, and the different cultural ways of being and knowing that come with them. So just to be completely clear, we are not equating decoloniality with anti-racist education. And an invitational and hospitable classroom would therefore be replete with encounters with difference, and understanding how to work in these spaces of interculturality would be a key part of working towards decolonizing classroom or educational relations. So on the left-hand side here, the larger red circle within a field, which is the deeper red of coloniality, represents the subject-object, I-it relation of separation that is othering. And it masks to some degree the subject-subject spiritual relation. So we're not saying that doesn't exist, but it's much harder for it to exist within that space. And not only that, the ways of being of coloniality and the ways of knowing of coloniality push the spiritual to one side. So they make the space for that interaction even smaller than it might be. And we've labeled this as a space of intercultural interaction, but without the critical element that might be necessary. And then on the right-hand side, the circles now have been shifted, and the ground that we are imagining as a decolonial space is shown in the mauve, with the orange subject-subject spiritual I-thou relation now taking more of the ground and sitting over the subject-object I-it form of relating. And you can see that both of those circles now have a hashed boundary, which is supposed to represent their porosity, because there is a dialogue between each of them and they are constantly in conversation with each other. And you can see here that the space of interaction is much greater, and that is what we are imagining as a space of critical interactions. So these interactions or interrelations are at the micro, the meso, and the macro scales. We're envisaging them as plural spaces of both and, of tensions and aporia, and of emergence and becoming, as in becoming fully human. And for relations to be authentic, the living center or guide or teacher would need to be inviting and hospitable in the ways that we have discussed earlier. And in order to begin to create these decolonial spaces for relations, the teacher would need to understand herself as fragmented and that we are all fragmented in a way because we all exist within a colonial space. And so this would be either because of a lack of understanding of those connections and relations to broader socio-cultural, geopolitical and historical contexts, or because her lived experiences of the oppressive forces of coloniality. And we've conceptualized this in the diagram as a move from being unconscious of colonial relations to becoming conscious and ultimately moving into another decolonial consciousness.
So I'm now going to talk a little bit about what we have done in to create educational spaces that are hospitable and inviting. So one of the first elements in decolonizing educational relationships is expanding awareness of self and identity and encouraging self-reflection on and understanding of one's own complicities in coloniality. And we did that with the first couple of lectures with our audience here as well. It is a process of becoming conscious of what was previous unconscious, as shown in the previous slide. And forgiveness is a crucial quality to foster in this process. The purpose is not to enter into a blame game about complicity in historic colonialism. Feelings of denial, for example, why should I be accountable for what my ancestors did? And guilt, I feel awful, for example, I feel awful about what my ancestors did, but I don't act in those ways, can act as a barrier to any meaningful change. Our purpose is therefore to distinguish between historic colonialism and contemporary coloniality, and to reveal how unconsciously each of us is complicit in different ways in the modern project of coloniality. Awareness and recognition of complicity requires a forgiving orientation on the part of both educator and student in order to be able to move forward in a proactive manner. So I'm going to give an example of what we've done here in Canada. The teacher education program in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina is focused on anti-oppressive and anti-racist education. And among other grad and undergrad courses that I teach, I also teach an elective course called e-reading 4-5, which is titled Culturally Responsive Literacy Education, which is taken by pre-service teachers in their fourth year in their final semester before graduation. So after 4 years in the Bachelor of Education program, right after they complete their semester of internship, they may choose to take this course. I had realized several years ago that educational relationships includes, but is not limited to teacher-pupil relations. In order to help the realization of the best potentialities in the pre-service teachers' lives, I needed to learn to see the student in what Buber states as in his potentiality and his actuality, and to do so through awareness of him as a whole being and affirm him in this wholeness. This was written in 1958, that's why it's got him, male, the gender stuff. But Buber, for Buber, ethical education entails educators engaging with others, with their whole being, through direct relations and dialogue. We had already started working in this way before we came to know about Martin Buber's work. However, we had to figure out a way to model and enact what Fisher in 2013 stated as authentic, loving, and humble human interactions that are transformational and affirming, in order that the pre-service teachers would experience how generosity, and here I mean invitation and hospitality in its many forms, humility, and different ways of being, doing, and viewing and thinking could enhance students' engagement and academic performance. We use the concepts of invitation and hospitality to invite students to start thinking about an ethical relationality with reference to the and intra-relatedness, inter and interconnectedness, and interdependence with humans, more than humans, and materiality. So in this slide, we show you how we moved from an institutional colonial way of doing education to a decolonial way, but always taking into account the requirements that we had to fulfill as mandated by the Saskatchewan Ministry of Education and the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. So you can see in terms of hospitality, we talked about and asked students, because in the 4 years that they were in the anti-racist, anti-oppressive program, they're constantly told, you are complicit, you are this, your forefathers did this, and so forth and so on. And so when by the time they come to me in the last semester before graduation, they've had so much of that. And so I had to start figuring out how to and they were all tight and very stressed about the whole thing. And so how to forgive ourselves, how can we all forgive ourselves, and as long as we understand our complicities, but then let's move forward. There must be a way to move forward so that we can address the harms that we've perpetrated. So basically opening the space and making a more holistic space for them, mind, body, spirit, everything was I worked with everything, the whole student. I had a very flexible syllabus, and Helen was talking about how hers is also flexible, and it was always changing. And I asked students what they wanted me to put into the syllabus as well, so that I would change according to their needs. In terms of during times of COVID, I would open up the space a half an hour before the class time and address each student individually as they came into the Zoom room, and talked and found out how their day was, or how what they'd done between the last class and today's class. And through that, building a community and a sharing of our spaces and our vulnerabilities, and to show them that we can all be vulnerable, but we can also all support each other and bring the whole group up rather than individuals. In terms of hospitality, the generosity, to work with them with a complete sense of generosity. If they needed multiple times to write assignments, sure. If they needed to come and meet with me outside office hours, sure. Anything that would help them to succeed academically. And again, this was in relation to the same thing in terms of challenging with Honey, was to also sustain that relationship and to work with each student's difference, because we do have Indigenous students in our classrooms who don't have equal access to educational opportunities. And we have students of color and African Canadians as well, who are marginally served by the community, by the education system. So any of those students that needed more work, I gave my time to them. We changed the assessment, and we had aesthetic responses. So when we designed the assessment, we made sure that every student would have something that they could excel in. And so we allowed aesthetic responses, gave them transcriptions of their teaching practice with the student, and to analyze that, they had to conduct, do critical reflections, use CDA, critical discourse analysis, but again, multiple chances for success. And the big thing was that I told every student when they walked into the classroom on the first day that they had all passed the course. And they only had one way to go, and it was up. So we started at the base pass mark, and I only had one way to go. But in order to go up, I had high expectations that they would fulfill all the criteria that was in the syllabus. But that stress of will I fail or pass was taken away. And so yes, and so it was very successful. There are comments online if you want to check it out on Rate My Professor. And if you put my name in there, you'll see students have very positive comments. So that's how we try to bring in the invitation and hospitality, the spiritual, the holistic, the care for the whole being.
Thank you, Fatima. And a lot of the students' thoughts about the ways in which we worked with them are in the paper that was circulated when you were invited to come to this seminar. So if you haven't had a chance to have a look at it yet, you might be interested to go and have a look at it. So this is just bringing us back to our imaginary and where we are in it. And we've now today explored the ideas of invitation and hospitality. And then next month in seminar 6, we're going to look at the other concepts that we've brought to this work, which is looking at the spaces, places, and boundaries of education and learning, and the ways in which those interact with our ideas of invitation and hospitality. And then in the seminars after that, we're applying it to things like pedagogy and research and so on. So we're just going to open this space up as we do every month to invite those of you who would like to stay on with us for the next up to half an hour to just have a general chit chat. And we're looking forward to doing that. Thank you.